At the same time, I was still trying to also maintain this athletic side of my life as well. So I think like the level of ambition I was trying to pursue at the same time taught me a lot about the value of focus. I struggled in particular when doing a mediocre job at both of them. And it was when I had kind of put everything else on back burner and really just started to purely commit as an athlete and really look for those kinds of results. That was when I think the writing on the wall became a lot more clear. I think also for like entrepreneurs and small business is that too often, and particularly from a creative standpoint, we don't die of thirst because for want of opportunity. Rather, we drown from having too many different opportunities and not really knowing which direction is up in order to come back and get some oxygen again. And I think that that's something that I'm constantly reminding myself of, because I'm usually my impulse is like, I want to go here, I want to go here, I want to go here. And being able to narrow down that focus is something I'm perpetually seeking and trying to dive in or deliver a big result.
Welcome to Unlocking Moves, where we want to cover those key pivotal moments and decision points that really change the lives of successful entrepreneurs and leaders. And as you know, I like to hear stories because I think we all learn the best from stories. And I want to hear not just their glory stories, I want to hear their gory stories. Because as I like to say, the bigger the shit show, the bigger the lesson. I've got a real treat for you on today's episode of Unlocking Moves. I have Ty Hagler, who has gone from a world-class kayaker to now an award-winning designer and innovator. And he has learned many lessons along the way. But Ty, before we get going, I think you know that I like to hit my guests up with the off-the-wall question or comment to really keep them on their toes, keep my audience on their toes. You ready for this?
I'm ready.
All right, so here we go. So as I've known you and as I've read about you, you're an introvert at heart, at least you were earlier in your life. You started the collegiate kayaking program at Georgia Tech. And as I understand it, that was a big part of helping remove some of the introvert tendencies from you. As the quote says, your introverted tendencies started slipping away as you learned to get others excited about the sport. And then starting the college club was great training to be an entrepreneur because you get to focus on the vision, people, and having fun. Tell me about that transition from an introvert, a nerd, to becoming a leader of a collegiate kayaking program.
I think it was more of embracing who I am, accepting the nerd, and making it more of a strength than anything else versus feeling in any way, I don't know, insecure about it. I don't know if you know anything about introversion, extroversion, that it's not something you necessarily grow out of, but rather this is where I draw strength. And, oftentimes my wife will see me come back from conferences and see me all like amped up from having gone and talked to a bunch of people. And I need to go and like curl up in a room for a couple of days before I go do that again. But I do, thoroughly enjoy that. And I think one of the things, you took me way back to that experience of, back in the collegiate days and everything. But I so enjoyed and learned the love of coaching others, whether that's people who decide to trust me and join the Trig team and be along for the ride, or the clients we work with, the startups that we work with, and really try to like build the best version of anybody who I'm interacting with. And that's more of a purpose reason why to get out of my shell. Otherwise, I'm perfectly happy to sit and read books and, go for long runs and whatnot. So, yeah.
Helping people identify the best version of themselves. I love that, Ty. As you guys can tell, Ty Hagler is my guest today on Unlocking Moves. He started his career at Home Depot and established an in-house innovation department. And the reason why he was at Home Depot, we'll get into it, spoiler alert, has to do with the Olympic Kayaking program. He subsequently founded an award-winning design consulting firm called Trig, which is responsible for bringing multiple breakthrough products to market, including the LifeFlow Infuser, which is a life-saving device, which we might get into. And most recently, something called a couplet care bassinet, which is over his shoulder there. And I'm sure we'll talk about that in a bit too. He also has an undergrad in industrial design from Georgia Tech and an MBA from North Carolina State. Let's go. And little known fact, you might know this, Ty, but I had Mark Godfrey, the former coach at North Carolina State basketball, on the pod a few weeks ago. So we can talk about that. So anyway, I can't wait to dive in with Ty Hagler. Welcome to Unlocking Moves.
Well, thank you, Kurt. I'm really thrilled to be here. And you gave such a great intro there.
Hey, it's a gift. Talking about other people and pumping them up is a great attribute of mine. Hey, I've got to start off with your story because you're the first kayaker that I've had on the program, especially a world-class kayaker. I will say that I do like to kayak in my spare time, and I will proudly tell you that I can kick my adult son's ass in kayaking. So shout out to, if you're listening, Luke, who's 24, Brady's 22, and Bennett is 18. But let's share your story about going from into that world. First, let's talk about that world, and then ultimately let's get into how you became an entrepreneur.
Okay, sure. So I grew up in Gainesville, Georgia, which was the site of the 1996 Olympics for rowing and canoe kayak. I was on Lake Lanier there, for anybody who's been from that area. And we got sucked into it because my parents both met as whitewater kayakers. And for them, they were bringing their kids along and didn't want them on the dangerous whitewater rapids and all of that. They knew the dangers there. And so this flat water sport seemed like it was a good thing to get bumped into. Plus, it was in our backyard effectively. I went from kind of pushing around plastic kayaks in the backyard through to like having these world-class athletes and world-class coaches and being a volunteer for the 96 Olympics. And it was kind of like one of those things where life just hands this to you and it's up to you to take as much of what's given to you and try to push it as far as you can. So I was, went to multiple world championships, was a national champion several times over, and just fell in love with the sport and took it as far as I possibly could.
Let's pause there just for a second because in 1994, you were 15 years old, 12 years old. How old were you?
14, yeah.
14 years old, and the seed was planted for you to get into this sport. Now, the fact that your parents were world-class whitewater kayakers, I'm sure helped, but something in you was motivated by seeing this Olympic sport in your hometown. Maybe talk a little bit about that, because I think we all underestimate the impact we can have on a 14-year-old in the world.
Yeah, I mean, it was about respecting the legacy of the 96 Olympics because I think we would often hear about the story of the Olympics when it came to Los Angeles, and there's just nothing left from, I think it was the 76 Olympics that was there. And there's just no legacy that was left behind. And I think so much of the investment in the Olympics, it was important to the organizers that we carry on that legacy and not just have it turn into a community center, but really have something that like it kind of leaves something behind that is like teaching a sport that was not there previously. And then it was also something that, I'm not great at ball sports. So like football, soccer, that kind of thing, it wasn't something I excelled at, but, being able to do like the nice thing about individual sports like this is you can put 1 ounce of effort in and see 1 ounce of return back. And it's within like a pretty controllable effort. And then also it's a pretty technical sport where you can study it and get into the technique, the biomechanics, the equipment, and get to like really high levels of performance before, kind of the ultimate reason why I had to tap out was just, I didn't have the Michael Phelps genetics that like I kind of discovered the upper end of what my genetics could do. And that was a good enough reason to be able to hang up the paddle.
Hey, let's stick on that biometrics and biomechanics piece for a second, because I know we talked earlier about being an inner nerd. You've got a lot of great innovative designs behind you that had to play into your passion for the sport. This idea that the aerodynamics of the paddle, the way that you glide through the water, the way you breathe. I mean, tell me about some of that and how it really fueled your passion for this, maybe even what you're doing now.
Yeah, so like the hydrodynamics, right? So the flow of how you stick the
Hey, I'm not an engineer. I don't know the difference between aerodynamics and hydrodynamics.
No, but I mean, like
You go through the air too, right?
you do go through the air. So we weren't quite at shaving our heads, but did it once or twice, right? No, you look at basically how the boat is shaped and you caring for the hull and making sure that all of your equipment is set correctly, because if you don't, then it breaks on you in the worst possible moment. So there is very much a interaction with your gear to be able to make sure you've got, good equipment. But then also there's like how you're positioning your body and good technique. There were tricks that I learned along the way that like allowed me to do better in crosswinds because of some technique that I just kind of picked up along the way. There's the strategy of racing. One of the really cool stories was I was always kind of perpetually on the bubble, just barely making the team kind of from a performance standpoint. And there was one year where the top four guys were in one four-person kayak. And then the next four guys were in the second four-person kayak. And I was number 8. And our club had done a lot of team boats. You go doubles and fours for your team boats. And I knew enough about getting the team to cohere quickly that I worked on the team. We got our start figured out. We got our timing and cadence worked out in our warm up, where the other team was maybe, a little bit more relaxed going into this of, hey, we've got this. So we went head to head racing, the top 4 against the bottom 4. And we just launched off the line. And the other boat panicked. And in a team boat, if you panic, it's like, and like you hear like an orchestra warming up and like several people go out of tune and there's no conductor. It just sounds horrible. It hurts too when everybody's not in sync with each other. And so they just kind of had this messy, horrible race down the way. And we were able to outperform them just through technique. And then we did head-to-head seat racing and all of that, and eventually kind of found my way into my spot on the team. But just knowing how to work with a team and good technique and everything you can find an edge in a sport that otherwise is very physical. One of my coaches talked about the artist and the lumberjack, is that oftentimes the artist can be just as competitive at who like understands the fluid and the flow and the technique versus the lumberjack who's just sitting there chopping wood and isn't really being efficient with their output.
And I like that story for a number of reasons. One, you identified the strength that you could have in that race, and that was the start. Let's get the start going quickly. Mm-hmm. And you focused on what was important to you. As I recall from another version of that story, you didn't have time to do a whole lot of training. You just had enough time to really focus on the start. And I read that in the Forbes article from 2018, if anybody's interested. And the other thing is, as you matured and became a leader in business, leveraging those same types of lessons. How do I get my team, in this case, a team of 4, to row in the same direction, which is a business analogy we use a lot, and ultimately overcome our competitors because we have an edge, as you said.
Yeah.
I like it. So you are a competitive world-class kayaker. You go on to the Olympic trials. You go on to train in California. You were, at the time, as I understand, working with the Home Depot Job Opportunities Program, which I'd love to dive into. But tell me about that stage of your career. And I know that's obviously before you became an entrepreneur.
If you're just joining us on Unlocking Moves, today's episode is brought to you as usual by Hire Better, the strategic talent partner for growth-minded entrepreneurs everywhere.
So there was, I was concurrently both trying to start my career, particularly as I graduated from Georgia Tech, and trying to make it as an industrial designer. And the field of industrial design is incredibly competitive in its own right, where it's kind of like trying to be a musician, where there's a threshold of skill you have to be at in order to do anything that's adding value in that space. And at the same time, I was also trying to train for the Olympics. And so I had a lot of false starts kind of coming out of school and trying to make it for paying my way through and also, trying to make the team. And so incredibly grateful to Home Depot for having the Olympic Job Opportunities Program, which was an interesting sponsorship hedge where, they would employ athletes full time. You work part-time in the store. And so you're supposed to engage with customers. And then at the same time, you get to train the rest of the time. And so a lot of people would just work in the stores. I was fortunate to be able to work corporate. And so I got to land in the advertising department and get to kind of apply some of the skills that I had picked up in school. But at the same time, I was still trying to also maintain this athletic side of my life as well. So I think the level of ambition I was trying to pursue at the same time taught me a lot about the value of focus. And I struggled in particular when, I was, kind of doing a mediocre job at both of them. And then it's like, fine, I will, and I had gotten married young. My wife and I got married in 2003. And so we were trying to figure out what life was like and trying to figure all of this out. And so like, all right, well, we're going to go all in on this kayaking adventure and move out to San Diego to live at the Olympic Training Center. And then I'll kind of put Home Depot on back burner. And it was when I had kind of put everything else on back burner and really just started to purely commit as an athlete and really look for those kinds of results. That was when I think the writing on the wall became a lot more clear, where the opportunity cost of continuing to pursue as an athlete versus kind of the rest of where I found a lot of joy and passion, really just isolating that one out, really recognized that like, okay, this isn't really for me. And in hindsight, I'm, happy with the choice that I made, but it did take going all in order to then be able to commit and then, kind of start my career as an entrepreneur. But it definitely was, I think focus was a big lesson learned in that moment of really trying to make sure that if you're going to compete at the highest level, whether it's in entrepreneurship or in sport, that having focus just makes all the difference.
I like that. The way I read some of that is as you were trying to keep your foot in both paths, you didn't quite know the level of commitment it might take to be a true, Olympian, if you will, in the sport. And it didn't come until you actually focus fully on that endeavor that you realize maybe this isn't what I want.
Right. And also kind of also hitting the reality of like my, my genetics, my physiology was like, all right, I'm hitting a level here and I'm watching my peers just kind of keep responding to the training. And I'm kind of responding like this. I'm like, I'm not on the right trajectory here. The data is not supporting this ambition that I have. And it was nice to have that closure where, I was just pushing myself up so hard in that direction.
Well, I told my kids as they were coming through sports and they realized they weren't going to be professional athletes or whatever. And there comes a time in everybody's career where their athletic career is over, with very, very few exceptions. And that is, you were given a gift, or you recognized the gift that you were given by hanging them up before you were another 5 years down the path, and who knows what. So I think that's a little underlooked thing or under-recognized thing for my listeners is there's often a gift in setbacks, there's always a gift in setbacks. Let's put it that way. Silver lining.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think each of the setbacks in sport, you have constant setbacks where you underperform where your expectations are, and knowing how to learn from each of those. And there's so much value in those lessons if you choose to take them as lessons and appreciate them, that those are what truly shape you. And I think that's a big part of kind of what you look to highlight as well.
It absolutely is. And I think that's a big part of unlocking moves is recognizing those moments when we, what can we learn from the setback? What can we learn from the victory? What can we learn in this situation? And having the introspection, the reflection, the insight to look at those as gifts.
Mm-hmm. And I think also for like entrepreneurs and small business, I was just talking about the reflection on focus, is that too often, and particularly from a creative standpoint, we don't die of thirst because for want of opportunity. Rather, we drown from having too many different opportunities and not really knowing which direction is up in order to come back and get some oxygen again. And I think that's something that I'm constantly reminding myself of, because I'm usually, my impulse is like, well, I want to go here. I want to go here. I want to go here. And being able to narrow down that focus is something I'm perpetually seeking and trying to dive in or deliver a big result.
Well, that's a struggle for a lot of entrepreneurs. So when you figure out, please let us know. This might be a great segue into Trig. So you were at Home Depot, as I understand, for a few years, and then something led you to branch off on your own and start basically a design firm. Tell me about that.
Yeah, the experience at Home Depot was very formative. A lot of what I learned in design school either was confirmed, say like the importance of doing customer research, that smacked me fully in the face. I thought I could skip that step, and no, you cannot skip that step. But at the same time, just like what actually matters for customers versus like kind of what, like maybe the aesthetic principles that might be taught, they're different priorities, I think, when you get out into the real world, but also the recognition that what designers do is pretty unique and special and is uncommon in a lot of the business world. And so understanding that, but also recognizing that I needed to learn the language of business because it wasn't a part of my lexicon then. As my wife was finishing up her PhD and had an opportunity up here in the Triangle, that was an opportunity for me to kind of take a step back from Home Depot and actually be more of an early remote worker to Home Depot as it transitioned out, and then also start Trig, and then also go back to school and get my MBA at NC State while I was figuring out how to run a business. And so that was a nice applied way to take business school where like, I need to figure out how to do marketing. Okay, I'll go take a marketing class and then go bug the professor because, well, what you're teaching isn't working. How do I make it work? And it's which is probably different than most students, but really taking it, applying it. I loved the strategy class and the business consulting class that I took because those definitely lit me up. And at one point in time, I was thinking, maybe I should get a PhD in innovation management. And then one of the professors pulled me aside and said, you've got everything you could possibly look for from having a PhD as a consultant, and you don't have all the academic nonsense to deal with. You just keep doing what you're doing. So, I think that was, leaving grad school and having the chance to double down on Trig was a really good opportunity to take everything that I had learned and build a little bit different design firm that, really understands kind of the complete business picture in which we're operating, where we're not too isolated into, design theory and isolation. So.
And what great counsel from a academic to give you that counsel and advice. That's unusual. And I hope you've reached out to him or her and thanked them for that counsel because
Yep. I've been back as a guest speaker several times.
that's awesome. So I want to dive deeper into Trig, but before we do, I want to give a quick shout out to our friend Lauren Feldman at 21 Hats, which is how we were connected. If you don't know what 21 Hats is, this portion of the show is sponsored by 21 Hats. I got to give him a shout out. Go to 21hats.com. Lots of resources for entrepreneurs and small businesses. And he's got some really great content out there.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Lauren and what he's doing with the 21 Hats community.
Perfect. Okay. So I know how you got started. I want to learn a little bit more about what you do at Trig. You mentioned in a previous conversation that when you work with all your clients, you sift through thousands of ideas in order to work with, find out what's going to work for those folks. Tell me a little bit about the design process, maybe even show us a couple things back there on your back shoulder.
Okay. Yeah, sure. So I think about maybe a metric. If you're looking at how to measure innovation, you really can't measure it by efficiency. Efficiency and innovation are polar opposites. If you're trying to combine those two, it's an oxymoronic statement, right? The more innovative you are, the less efficient you are. And the more efficient you are, the less innovative you are, just by definition. And so therefore, how do you measure how effective your innovation efforts are? And this is where I like to point to cost per lesson learned, meaning that if you can reduce the overall cost of each lesson you're doing, then let's say you could learn whether or not an idea would work by putting it down on a sticky note and sketching up hey, what do you think about, Spider-Man slinging a web over this truck in order to keep things down? Okay, well, that's, that actually turned into a product. But I think using lateral thinking, which is the absurd, provocative ideas that then can be translated and moved into something pragmatic and practical. It's a nonlinear approach to creativity. And particularly in this domain, the psychology of creativity is really interesting, but quantity is quality, meaning the person who comes up with more ideas comes up with the best ideas.
Okay.
And so, just you think about it from a probabilistic standpoint, the first idea you come up with versus 1 out of 300 ideas you come up with, the first idea is likely not going to be your best one. And so you want a wealth of ideas to choose from. And so
no idea is a bad idea, and you're just brainstorming, throwing that stuff against the wall.
I will qualify that in that we will reserve time for no judgment on the bad ideas.
Fair enough.
And I used to keep Nerf guns at these sessions I would do. And so if somebody shot down somebody else's idea too early while we were in this divergent reserved judgment space, then you could shoot them with the Nerf gun. And so we were doing this with the cardiothoracic team at UVA, and the head of cardiology shot down somebody else's idea. And there was a mad scramble on the table to get the Nerf gun to be able to, there was permission in that space to shoot him with the Nerf gun. And because it is really hard because we all think convergently most of our lives. And so having that time to say, yeah, this is a stupid idea. Anti-gravity is not going to work. But what we could do is build upon that and say, well, what if we use, say, like from a lawnmower, why don't we use the blades to create a helicopter inside the lawnmower to then like you remove the wheels as a factor. So there's things you can do to build upon the ideas of others and keep it from a good improv practice standpoint to make for more productive creative sessions. And then when we split the switch, okay, now let's be merciless and kill ideas and sift through and get down to that maybe 1% of gold in a haystack of bad ideas to then find the best idea to then go through and test with customers and figure out the problem we identified over here. Did we actually solve it or did we just create a big mess? And that's usually our proof point and the reason for going through this full process so that you can solve for problems that otherwise haven't been solved yet. All the easy stuff has already been solved.
Well, first of all, that sounds like a badass job to be able to just
It's
come up
so
with
much fun.
awesome things. And I got to come back to something you said a few minutes ago that I can't let drop. You said shoot spider webs out of Spider-Man's hands and you made it into a product to put things into trucks or secure things in a truck. Tell me about that process.
So I try to, and when we run our ideation sessions, I try to be the weirdest one in the room, in part to create psychological safety for other people. And so I'm usually trying to throw out the most, bizarre thing I can think of, and then throwing that out there. And if it makes other people laugh, then that's a good sign you're doing the right stuff. So that's where like, okay, maybe it's Spider-Man and we're trying to figure out how do we keep stuff from falling off of the truck without crushing the stuff that's on the truck. And so like, all right, what about Spider-Man? And like, it shoots at something. And then as it turns out, this kind of webbing actually exists. So the cost on it isn't going to be that expensive. And so it's actually a pretty pragmatic idea, but you have to start with the crazy ones and then go through a filtering process of, well, would this work, would this work, would this work, and then get down to something. So you're doing a nonlinear path to get to something pragmatic. But you wouldn't have got there of saying like, hey guys, how do we cost effectively solve this problem is your priming. Or one of the ways that I can tell if we've done a bad job of setting up an ideation session is if everybody uses has an app idea, because then they're primed by the interruptions from their phone. And like, well, that's the idea I've got is like, my phone's interrupting me. So there we go. Versus pushing people to think much more broadly and much more unconventionally, which you have to be very intentional about that. And probably a bit of stand-up humor comes a long way with that.
That's awesome. Hey, there's another, I want to switch gears slightly. We talked before the show, we talked a little bit about the concept of venture capital and what you call the fading effectiveness of venture capital, and really the concept of the venture studio, which I know is maybe not new, but it's relatively new to people's mindset. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, I mean, the first venture studio probably was about 20 years ago or so. And so with venture capital, it's increasingly, they're looking for a 10x return on any investment. And in order to find those investable opportunities, they're really having to look earlier and earlier in a startup progression. But at the same time, the time horizon from a venture capital standpoint, the businesses that take venture capital oftentimes are not well positioned because of the immediate returns that are needed or the short-term, very fast growth returns that are needed. And that's not necessarily always the right match for a lot of the opportunities and ideas that we look at. And so by contrast, I think with a venture studio, the biggest return on your investment is founder equity. If you think about when you started your business and the amount of cash you put into it compared to an investor, you're getting a much bigger return on your investment as a founder than you are somebody coming in at a Series A or Series B, just because you're there at the origination of the enterprise. So what's distinct from venture capital, which is kind of looking at opportunities as they come by, but maybe having an operating role or not in that, maybe coaching and nurturing it or not, but rather just looking for the upside on the growth and sales trajectory. With the venture studio, you're really looking at from the beginning, how do you nurture this idea and go from 0 to 1, which is kind of a unique skill set that I've built up over my career, and kind of know how like how to kill the things that aren't going anywhere, how to nurture the ones that are looking promising, and like, okay, this spider web, idea actually has some merit to it. Let's pursue this thread versus this other one. We need to just make that one go away and be very selective with it. But then also start to assemble the team. Like, how do you find the right founder for this? How do you find the right resources, and building a network that like helps to support these different startups? So a venture studio itself spins out 2 to 3 startups a year. Whereas by contrast, accelerators will like, spread out across a lot of different startups, but there's not really a strategic direction to it. You're just kind of taking what comes in and trying to help further that within that, but there's not as much focus, and there's also not as much, say, founder equity in that.
Well, a couple of things I appreciate about that. One is it's help the support and the advice and mentorship to entrepreneurs. The venture capital industry seems to be more about money and making big bets and hoping 1 out of 10 pays off and pays back the fund. And then the other 8 or 9 that don't make it, so be it. It's just part of the, collateral damage. I like the venture studio concept. It feels like it's more humane and got more staying power.
I like to think so. It's definitely something that depends on your track record. And you want to be able to demonstrate that you can be, you do need people that are in the top 1% who are working on these and need to be great entrepreneurs, because it's very easy to just wander around and do a bunch of blue sky activities that don't go anywhere. There's a lot of corporate innovation teams that do just that. And corporate innovation is almost exactly the same as a venture studio. And you see a lot of different models of that out there. We've certainly had the privilege to get to work with a lot of those. It's just taking it from an in-house corporate innovation group and then having it be a standalone entity that then is hopefully pushing the successful fruits of that into some of the larger companies.
Can I assume that you are involved in a venture studio, or you're going to launch a venture studio, or tell me how Trig is involved?
Yeah, so we're seeing the Midst Venture Studio as a sister organization to Trig. So Trig itself is an industrial design consulting firm, but the Venture Studio is operating a pipeline of ideas that are then, kind of looking for those startup founders to come alongside, the clinical experts to help support as, say, a chief medical officer for someone we're looking for, applying for NIH, SBIR grants in order to fund some of those activities, get the non-dilutive funding in. That really also provides that positive signal or a gate, so that if you have the National Institute of Health that is agreeing that you've identified a significant unmet need from a healthcare standpoint, and you have a credible pathway in order to address that, that's a significant positive signal to other funding organizations that you've cleared a pretty significant threshold. And it's a good, proof point for us, so we don't get too, impressed with ourselves, but rather have an external factor to help say this is worth further investment.
Is there anything else you want to dive into on that topic? Because it sounds like most of your time is spent with Trig, but this sounds like it's something's very interesting for you to as well. Is this your future career, to be solely in the venture studio business?
I believe so. I think the two are complementary to each other, and that the work we do at Trig serves the venture studio, and the venture studio also serves Trig. And so it's really, the model is one where we perpetually work in a concave environment where if we're successful, then our clients have a massive upside. And so just wanted to set it up so that we're bringing our unique skills in order to, kind of see more of that process of like building some of these like, great, exciting entrepreneurial adventures.
I love it. And I like is planting the seeds with that next generation of entrepreneurs and giving them the tools that they need to be successful. Okay, so we're at the point of the show where I want to ask you about your unlocking move, which again is a key pivotal moment or decision point that really changed the trajectory of your life or your career. Any idea what 1 or 2 might be for you?
I know we've touched on some of them. Like, I think going from qualifying for Home Depot's Olympic sponsorship program and that high intensity progression of moves that happened during that time period was so pivotal for me. I think also that decision to commit to Trig, but then also hire that first employee That was something that took me from, I don't know, like an individual, I don't know, freelancer, let's say, to then doing that separation from kind of like Michael Gerber's E-Myth, separating out from being the, kind of the one who's wearing all of the hats to now having that first employee and then saying, I'm not going to be the best designer. Rather, I'm going to deal with all the other stuff and break down barriers so that the designer, the young designer I'm pulling in, can be the best version of themselves. And it was just a maturation for me of really trying to figure out how do you run a larger organization and function in a larger context. And I think being able to figure out how to level up in that context has been something I've been perpetually working on. And then the next one I'd say would be
Hey, if you don't mind, let's stick on that just for a second, Ty,
yeah,
because I want to hit a point home, and that is setting yourself up and the team around you to be the best version of themselves was in itself an unlocking move, because whenever we're performing and doing the things that we're great at, we can make beautiful music. And if we're doing something that we're trying to fight with our left hand behind our back or whatever, we're going to struggle and we might not ever get over the top. But if we can have that team that's working together at their highest and best use, we can make beautiful music, to use your orchestra example earlier.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think also setting, the other thing I learned during that time period was setting achievable challenges in front of those people, where from an innovation context, you're constantly learning. Like there's no point in time where you can just sit still and say, yeah, we've innovated everything you possibly can. We're done. Like you don't need to learn anything new. Like we're perpetually having to pick up new software. And so there's definitely an art to giving somebody a challenge that's just outside of their skill set and watching them achieve it. Or if not, then coaching them along to achieve it and then setting the next one. And so I've just, consistently seen people perform to just kind of that appropriate next level where we get to some really cool results just through knowing how to manage a creative team to do some really fun stuff.
And that's awesome. I appreciate that very much. So we have a couple key questions for you left.
Okay.
One is, you know that I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Who's Your Mike? The No Bullshit Guide to the People You'll Meet on Your Entrepreneurial Journey. I know you're familiar with it. Can I ask you what your favorite character or two might be from the book?
Yeah. I mean, Mike in particular, I mean, like, that's, kind of who you jump to, right? So I think what struck me with the character of Mike that you reference is that loyalty that, the founder has to Mike. That, Mike is right there alongside and is just, trying their darndest to like keep up with this growing organization and not let their friend down. And I think that loyalty was, like something you always want to honor and support. But at the same time, there is a point where the organization is just growing in a different direction than is in the best interests of everybody involved. And that's taken me a long time to figure that out because I'm an intensely loyal person by nature. And understanding that distinction of just because the organization's going in a different direction. And, it may be that from Mike's case, he needed to go in a different direction as well. And that's okay. And kind of recognizing that sometimes what's best for all people is just to look at this and say, you know what, we have grown tremendously together. And the next spot for you to grow doesn't necessarily have to be in this organization, and we can still be friends through this. And I've taken a lot of pride in, the people who've worked with me have stayed for, many, many years. And I've really seen this as being a net exporter of talent. And I think with Mike, you look at Mike and he grew tremendously during his time during that story. And that's a lot to celebrate there too. So that one just jumped out at me and just appreciated that story. So,
Well, I appreciate it. It feels like every entrepreneur either has a mic, has had, or will have a mic. And I love your awareness there that you recognize that he or she, in your case, learned a lot and was very valuable to you. And you realized that you had outgrown him or her. And a lot of entrepreneurs, it's very hard for them to come to that decision. Let's put it that way. They have a loyalty that's, and they also hate conflict as well. So thank you for sharing that. Okay. I've got another key question I like to ask is I like to consider myself the listener's advocate. If I've got Ty Hagler here one-on-one, what kind of question would I want Kurt to ask? And I want to dive into a topic that we've touched on before, but I want to get into more of the humanistic element of it. And that is when you were in California training to be an Olympian, your new wife is, I think, across the country, maybe in Georgia. Was she in Atlanta or where was she at?
It was in Atlanta at the time. Yeah.
Okay. And you made this decision, obviously, with her to really forgo your dream. And then there's a lot of emotions in there. You had probably a 3-day drive back across the country to get back home. Tell me about what that felt like and what you learned from it, because we talked earlier about learning from those challenges.
That was, like you've got, let's see, there's a lot to unpack there. I think one, just, a lot of gratitude to my wife for being supportive of this. She was ready to really kind of curtail a lot of her PhD studies and wrap up in San Diego and kind of follow me on this journey. So she was supportive kind of during this transition period. The plan was that she was going to come join them. And so I'm just very grateful for that. And at the same time, kind of doing an about face, reversing course from where I had been, there was all this direction that, like, I was the guy that was training to go to the Olympics. Like, that was the thing. And then to change that up, it was like there was a core part of, I don't know, who I was in that moment that was free, and kind of that uncertainty of what comes next, and really trying to figure out, what am I going to do next? For the longest time, I wanted to be a kayak coach because I thought I enjoyed that part of it. And really just figuring out, like, the intellectual challenge of what I'm doing really is where I was fulfilled. I should spent the car ride back. I had bought a book on tape, which was the Jim Collins Good to Great book, which that lit me up. And like, oh, okay, I've got all these things I want to go build. And I think it was figuring out, taking that time to, I don't know, like, kind of sit out under the shade tree, so to speak, and just, reflect and figure out what comes next, I think. And then for us to start rebuilding our lives and start making more decisions closer to just, building a family and kind of, figuring out what are our priorities in life. I think that it really reached a kind of probably going from being a 20-something into just maturing into being ready to have a family. And that was, kind of a big pivotal point in my life.
And that's great awareness. And I know we talked earlier about making lemonade out of your lemons, and that's your dream was crashed at that point, and you recognized it, and you knew you had bigger things to offer than just kayaking. So I applaud you for that. Okay, so my last question is somewhat of a trick question.
Uh-oh.
That is, tell me one thing that you're never asked, and either you wish they would ask you, or you're secretly glad that you're not asked.
This is like the most embarrassing question you could possibly ask.
There
right?
you go.
Goodness, I'm going to have to think about this one.
I've got I give myself a prompt just in case,
Okay.
right? Because this is a trick question. But from what I understand, you were able to combine your 3 biggest passions, which was kayaking, which was art, and engineering.
Mm.
And I know some of that was through your work with, and becoming starting the kayaking program at Georgia Tech, and some of it may be applied with what you're doing today. So I don't know, take that question where you want from there.
Let's see. So even you're touching on these, like, kind of 3 different topics, right? Of, kind of it's like the universal theory of it. You can pull from a lot of different areas that you find exciting and passionate. And I'm usually trying to pull together this professional, tapestry of all the different things that I find interesting and really try to make something coherent out of it. And usually I think it turns into some interesting and surprising, overlaps there where, okay, so one of the direction for this is with cross-pollination. This is one of the key opportunities professionally that we look at is as you go from one domain to the next, that's usually where the greatest, kind of like, I don't know, like new insights, the new discoveries come from. And for me professionally, coming from the land of power tools and hand tools at Home Depot and playing with those designs, and then going into surgical devices, they might seem at the surface to be 2 completely different industries, but you're dealing with human hands trying to perform a job and something happening on the other end of that. And there was so much crossover to that I found really compelling and interesting. And I think the combination of a lot of those different passions of, like looking at biomechanics and the, pursuit of athletics, and then also like a lot of what we've discovered with medical devices and being so cool and compelling is just, kind of anywhere you can find that overlap and cross-pollination of different activities is a fun place to be. So.
And one of the key takeaways I heard from that is having a diverse line of thinking in the room with you as you're brainstorming these new concepts. You might have somebody from, professional baseball, or somebody who's a garbage man, or, any number of places that might have some input. Even a dumb entrepreneur like myself can maybe ask dumb questions that really come out like, hey, Spider-Man webs, perfect. We can make something with that.
Actually, yeah, there's so much truth in what you just said there of having people, because oftentimes when you're working on a new product, having representation from each of the groups of people who are engaging with this during a creative session, or even asynchronously as you get validation from each of those, makes for a complete solution. And you're just so much stronger from having diverse viewpoints when you're working on a new project.
Well, whenever you want that dumb entrepreneur's perspective that asks dumb questions, just invite Kurt Wilkin into the mix.
Anytime. We'll have you on the next one.
Let's go. Hey, on that note, Ty, we're going to wrap this puppy up. I'm going to invite the audience to please go like and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you consume your podcast. And please give us a 5-star review along with a couple of key comments. And Ty, thank you so much for joining me here on Unlocking Moves.
Thank you, Kurt. It was such a pleasure.
If you're an entrepreneur and you think you might have outgrown a member of your team, or maybe you've got a mic, as we talked about in Who's Your Mic, check out this quiz at who'syourmic.com/quiz. That's who'syourmic.com/quiz.